Most people value civility. They want to treat one another how they themselves want to be treated. But sometimes things get in the way. When we're under stress, civil people can kind of malfunction, behaving in ways that they never would otherwise, treating one another in ways that are dismissing, discounting, and or demeaning. Rare occurrences of incivility can be absorbed by healthy relationships in a healthy culture. People don't expect perfection in order to work together, but we don't want incivility to become the norm. Let's look at oh, some of the causes of the erosion of civility. And this is put out by a study, and they actually do this study about every year. I put the URL down at the bottom of the slide, but it's also in our list of resources. But there are certain factors that kind of rise to the top that people feel are contributing to the erosion of civility in America. And 57% of people that were surveyed said that social media was a big factor into this, because social media really encourages unruly, disrespectful behavior, as it allows people to hide behind a mask, and it can so they can become unaccountable. For example, if you read the comment section of most online articles, if you're ever in doubt of that, I have the app Nextdoor, and I'm sometimes just floored by some of the things that people post that are so uncivil on that app. But there are things that we can do to kind of turn that tide a little bit. Is we can try to post more positive things and flag info that is uncivil, and share or post stories about people who act uncivilly, and then start a conversation about it. And something that's actually been happening right now as we speak is holding social media companies more accountable, putting their feet to the fire when it comes to this. Now, the next one down is the White House. 50% of respondents felt that, what's going on in the White House it can cause the erosion of civility. 73% of people feel that incivility leads to a political gridlock, and 71% the outcome is less political involvement. And because of that, 61% fewer people are actually running for public office right now, which is kind of a sad situation. If you look at politics in general, or politicians in general for that matter, it's 47%. And while politics has never been a landscape for the weak-kneed, our political parties have become increasingly polarized. Debate is especially negative, with vicious, vitriolic personal attacks and name-calling at their worst ever. And compromise, so vital to progress, has become a dirty word. And, the next few months, until Election Day, next couple months, we're going to see so much of this. I know here in the Colorado area, we already are seeing a ton of it. And I, quite frankly, am really tired of it. Now, the next one down is news media, and that's 40%. And, the news media were once the vanguards of fairness and balance, but oftentimes they've substituted hard-hitting, in-depth, and factual reporting with more entertainment fluff. And you probably know of the news outlets that I'm talking about. By all means, not all of them are like that. Absolutely not. But, there are a fair share that are. I'm also part of the survey that they came out with. Americans, 93% of Americans identify incivility as a problem. 68% classify it as a major problem. And now these figures are from 2019. It'll be interesting to see how this changes for 2020. 74% believe civility is worse compared to a few years ago. 80% of people have experienced uncivil behavior. And I would imagine that's a little low, that some people may not be reporting it or may not even, realize it. The average person has 10.2 average weekly encounters with uncivil behavior. That's a lot. So let's look at some of the stats about civility in the library. There are, 91.1% of people actually have experienced incivility in the library setting. This is library staff. It's library is the workplace. And then the second chart shows you, how many times this occurs with people who answered the survey. 41.7% attributed incivility to communication methods, negative and rude talking or yelling in the workplace. And a little bit over 39% attributed incivility to behavioral methods. And that's where you're bullying, you're mobbing, disrespect, unprofessional actions, passive aggressive behaviors, moodiness, all of that enters into it. The workplace is where employees with diverse backgrounds and opinions can work together and should work together to pursue shared objectives, which are unencumbered by the divide and tensions that exist elsewhere.
And just really quickly, I wanted to kind of interject, the quote that we have on the screen here, that the workplace can serve as a safe haven from the incivility that confronts many Americans in everyday life. And I think that that's great, and it's a great aspiration to work towards. But I think we have to recognize that for many people, and we've just seen some of the statistics, that that's not simply the case. And I found an academic researcher, and she actually happened to be the ACRL 2019 Academic Research Librarian of the Year, Katrina D. Davis Kendrick. And she has been researching what she calls low morale in American libraries. And low morale, as she describes it, is the result of repeated and protracted exposure to emotional, verbal, written, and system abuse or neglect in the workplace. She has both a blog and a Facebook group, which I have included in the resources. And if you download the workbook that is available on the screen, or later download it from CSL in session, I provided links to both of those because she posts some really amazing things, but also some tools that can help people kind of get past some of this and work with it, and kind of as a support group. But the Facebook group has over 1,000 members. So just something to add there. So, what we'd like to have you do right now is think about what does civility in the workplace look like to you? What are some behaviors that you might describe as being civil? And go ahead and place those in the chat. While you guys are doing that, I noticed that one of our McCarthys, we have a couple, was talking about mask wearing right now, and we probably should have rewritten our entire presentation to talk about some of that, because mask wearing and incivility is increasing. But in terms of behaviors, holy moly, you guys are coming fast and furious. Greeting people, saying good morning or hello, active listening, respect for others' opinions, asking for feedback and listening to ideas, letting people be introverted or extroverted, or letting people be authentic, I think. Listening and involving stakeholders, courtesy and patience, not making assumptions. So basically, you guys have all passed the test, and I don't think we actually need to do the rest of today's session because you guys have some really great ideas here. Yeah, I like active listening, avoiding judgment. These are all great. Excellent. So if you have other ideas, keep them coming, but I think I'll have Jean kind of pick up and see if there were any that we may have missed. I don't think so, though.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, you guys did a great job. One thing I should have changed on this slide is, instead of smiles, is to put smiling with your eyes, because that's the only thing that's going to be visible at this point. But your eyes can really tell a story, and I think most people recognize when you're pleased to see them, or when you're, grateful for something they've done. They can read it in your eyes very, very easily.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like what a couple people have mentioned it, but S just mentioned it in terms of accepting differences. And according to journalist and author Stephen Petro, the original meaning of civility was actually citizens willing to give of themselves for the larger good. I think in many cases it can also sometimes take on negative connotation, where you're then talking about rules and, certain ways of behaving. And so once again, what we're trying to talk about is not really about appeasement, or not keeping in line and not rocking the boat, or making sure that you have to uphold the status quo. But we're really talking about a lot of the stuff that you guys are talking about in terms of mutual respect, kindness, support for one another. So that is fabulous. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add here, Jean, before we moved forward?
No, I think we can go ahead and go forward. Thanks, Christine.
So on the flip side, what might be some behaviors that you might consider as incivil or rude or disrespectful? I'm sure we'll have quite a few here also. And remember that this might really look different for each of us. Each person, once again, brings unique experiences to the workplace and to life in general. And so what might feel uncivil to me might not be uncivil to somebody else. So abruptness, not listening, being ignored and being dismissive, interrupting, not giving your full attention. You guys are giving us your full attention today because you guys are typing so fast. Eye rolling. Yeah, and sometimes like in Zoom, I have to remember that like my face is on the screen. And so some of those nonverbal cues like eye rolling, deep sighing, closed body language, cutting a person off. And not being seen, being invisible, not giving a verbal response. Yeah, there's nothing kind of more awkward than when you're talking to somebody and like they don't say anything or look at you. Not supporting staff in front of other patrons, being argumentative. So once again, these kind of run the gamut and can be really, really personal to each individual. So hopefully as we go through today, we'll learn some way of dealing with stuff. And Nancy Bolt makes an excellent point that people in trauma may actually be more sensitive. They might be more sensitive on both sides of the scale. So if people have been experiencing trauma, and right now there's a lot of trauma going on in the world, they might be apt to act in a way that might seem uncivil, but they also might be a little bit more sensitive to others' behavior towards them. And so it can really be sort of like this ongoing cycle where if we start assuming best intent and those kinds of things, we might be able to kind of help keep the conversation going. So this is fabulous. Jean, was there anything that they missed in their telltale signs?
I don't think so. I think everything, we've covered everything. Rude behavior, disrespect, ignoring others, snarky comments. They've all been mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, and Shay mentioned also people who don't know your job but will tell you how to do it. Yes, that happens probably in almost every profession, but I think it happens to service workers quite a bit as well.
I really like this quote. Incivility is in the eyes of the recipient. It's how people feel they are being treated. And what matters is not whether people actually were disrespected or treated insensitively, big word, but whether they felt disrespected. It's how they felt about the interaction. Incivility is in the eye of the recipient. It varies not just by the individual, but also by culture, gender, generation, industry, organization. And what you consider uncivil may not be the same thing someone else considers to be uncivil. And I think this is really something that was eye-opening for me. I hadn't really thought about it this way, and I find myself being much more careful now than I ever was before. What I may say to one person, I may think twice about saying to another person because it might not be appropriate. So let's look a little bit about, why do we care about, acting civilly, and what does uncivil actions look like? Well, there's been a lot of studies that have been done that show that there are some results about, having to work in an uncivil environment. For example, customers' satisfaction. When patrons or customers experience rude behavior, it really makes them uncomfortable. And I'll tell you what, they're quick to either walk out or hang up the phone or just totally disconnect with you. 25% of respondents take their frustrations out on customers or patrons. 48% intentionally decreased their work effort, and 47% intentionally decreased their time at work. Work just isn't a safe, comfortable place to be anymore. And so people will find any way they can to, leave get out of the environment. 80% indicated they lost time at work due to ruminating about experienced incivility. And I also think that sleep can enter into that too. I call them my middle of the night anxiety attacks. When you wake up during the night and you're constantly playing something that happened at work over and over again in your head, and you just don't sleep. Also, there's 38% intentionally decrease the level of the quality in their work. Creativity is really an interesting one. 30% of response were less creative than others, and they tend to produce 25% fewer ideas. And what's interesting is the surveyors, what they did is they took two groups of people, and one group they exposed them to really uncivil behavior, and the other one was more civil behavior. And then they asked each group separately. They asked the first group was, the ones that were treated badly. They asked them what they could do with a brick. Very simple. They handed them a brick and said, "What would you do with this?" Well, this group of people said, "Well, I guess you could, build a house or build a wall or maybe build a school." And that was about it. But they found that those who were treated well came up with some very creative ideas of what to do with that brick. They said they can sell it on eBay, use it as a goalpost for a street soccer game, hang it on a museum wall and call it abstract art, or decorate it like a pet and give it to their child as a present. So, the very creative responses, and I just think it's a good example of how it does make a difference. 78% of those who experience uncivil behaviors become less committed to the organization. 66% suffered decline in overall performance, and 78% lowered their commitment to the organization or to the library. So these are some of the reasons about why we should care about having a civil work environment.
So Jean discussed the cost of incivility to the business or the organization, but there really is a huge cost to employees as well. The FAAS Foundation, which funds efforts to create healthy and safe work environments, along with scientist Zorana Ivcevic-Pringle, did some research. And even before the pandemic, 50% of workers described feeling stressed and frustrated and overwhelmed at work. And many of the things that they shared that caused them to feel these unpleasant emotions were related to other people in the workplace. So I recently finished reading the book Permission to Feel, which I highly recommend. It's in your list of resources. And among other things, the author talked about emotional labor, which is basically the effort required to manage emotions. And we spend a lot of time not only managing our own emotions, but also managing our reactions to other people. In 2018, a Gallup poll surveyed over 30,000 people, and 34% of them said that they routinely missed 3 to 5 work days per month owing to job stress. Similarly, in the book Indistractable, the author talked that depression cost the U.S. economy over $51 billion annually in absenteeism, and this is just those who reported having an official diagnosis of depression. And according to a Stanford University study, more than 120,000 deaths annually may be attributed to workplace stress, and it can account for over $190 billion in healthcare costs. Amy Edmondson, who is an organizational behavioral scientist at Harvard, has studied psychological safety. And basically, psychological safety is the belief that one will not be punished for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And knowing that your voice matters and that you're not stuck in an uncaring, unchangeable machine has a positive impact on well-being. And so, as we said at the beginning of our session, one of the things we like to do in CSL in session is have you guys share your stories and your thoughts and your ideas. And I've been looking at the chat, and it has been going fast and furious, so that is great, because we want to be opening and welcoming to people in these discussions. So the last piece of this, or a last piece of this, as Jean alluded to, is that incivility can directly affect our relationships with others. And not just within our organization, but those the patrons that we serve. And so most of your organizations have a mission or value statement. How many of you can recite your mission and value statement? We're not going to give you a test. But sometimes they can be, very broad and kind of vague, but they're a good place to start when you're looking at sort of like what behaviors might you want to focus on. So you can see on the screen here, the Colorado State Library helps libraries, schools, museums, and other organizations improve services, making it easier for all Coloradans to access and use the materials and information they need for lifelong learning. And our values are access, education, integrity, and service. And so, according to Russ Harris, who's the author of The Happiness Trap, values are how we want to be, what we want to stand for, and how we want to relate to the world around us. So when I think of civility, I really think about my organization's mission and values, and I ask myself, like, how can I live this every day? How can I show up as an employee, as a peer, as a colleague, and how can we show up as an organization? So I think that those are things that we can think about as we move forward as well. So as we move into the rest of the session, try to keep your organization's mission and values in mind, or look them up. Look them up later and kind of reacquaint yourself with them. And I'm just loving the chat that is happening. There's a lot of really good discussions happening. We've had talk about differences in generations, and like what is sarcasm, and sometimes even phrases that people say can on occasion be considered rude. But I'm going to hand it back to Jean here. Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Christine. Just curious, do we have any supervisors in the room? If you are a supervisor, just raise your hand. I won't call on you or I won't pose any questions, but I'm just curious. So we do. We have quite a few. Interesting. Well, we wanted to be all inclusive, so I've got, a couple of quick slides about, what supervisors can do as far as creating a more civil work environment. A leader must model the desired behavior for an organization. They set the tone, so you need to be aware of your actions and of how you come across to others. I've used this expression for so many years about, walking the talk. We can talk all we want to about creating this kind of an environment or workplace, but unless we're willing to do the hard work ourselves, chances of it becoming successful are probably pretty weak. If you think about some of the things that you may or may not be doing currently, for example, if we know that it's rude to leave your phone on in meetings and take phone calls in the middle of a meeting, and sometimes our leaders or our supervisors feel that they don't need to do those kinds of things, but they expect their staff to do them. So just think about it. Do you turn off your phone in meetings? Make sure that you're paying attention to questions, and that's everybody's questions in the group. Follow up on any promises that you've made, because there's one thing that your staff will notice is when you've made a promise and you haven't followed up on it, or you've never said anything about it ever again. You want to express your appreciation, and that's so easy to do. A simple thank you. Ask for feedback. You may need a reality check from those around you. Also, eliminate gossiping behind others' backs. Even if you think that you have a safe person that you can kind of vent to, be really careful about doing that. And some other things that, a supervisor can do is, set really clear expectations for workplace behavior. And that starts with hiring for civility. Making sure that you're creating policies on what civil, behavior looks like in your library, and, giving them to a job applicant and gauging their reaction on that. to see if you feel that, they may have a more civil personality. Also, make sure that you're encouraging professional development with your staff by teaching civility, offering up opportunities for them to learn about it. Similar to the webinar today, have them watch it because it will be recorded. You want to create group norms, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You want to reward good behavior and penalize bad behavior. And post-departure interviews are really important. If somebody's leaving the library, find out why. But doing it, sometimes if you do it, a few days after that person has left and giving them some time to kind of, step away from the situation, you might get some really honest answers that maybe there's an underlying culture at play in the library that makes it uncomfortable to be there. You want to make your library a safe space. Make the workplace safe for raising concerns and even disagreements. Some organizations have Can We Talk sessions, which are discussions where employees from different levels of backgrounds can engage honestly on controversial topics. I think that's an amazing idea, and it's something I want to bring up at the State Library because I think it's awesome. So now, that's all I had about the supervisors, but let's talk a little bit about, what can you do personally? It's more of the holistic approach. Rather than change the offender or the corrosive working relationship, you can make yourself impervious to, or at least a lot less vulnerable to uncivil behavior within the environment, because sometimes it's much easier to change ourselves than to try to get somebody else to change. And it's found that healthy people are more resilient, that they're buffered against distractions, stress, and negativity. So think about thriving cognitively, feeling hurt or outraged, but only for a limited time. So it's okay to have those feelings and those emotions, but don't let them overtake your life. Go ahead, feel them, experience them, and pack them up and put them away. No pity parties. They can't last for too long. Also, journaling and other rituals can help bring a little bit of closure. Professional development, once again, identify, areas for development and actively pursue learning opportunities in them. You can take on a new hobby, a skill, or a sport. Or you can work with a mentor, somebody who's willing to give you a reality check. Then if you want to thrive effectively, just feeling healthy and experiencing passion and excitement at work and outside of work as well, both, in work and out of work. And a lot of this we can get through just sleeping well, making sure that we're exercising, eating healthy, mindfulness, and stress management. All the things we know we should be doing, but are we actually doing them? So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christine.
So going back to the book Permission to Feel, the author Mark Brackett states that we assume that work is powered by skills and experience and by brain power and accomplishment. But he postulates that actually emotions are the most powerful force in the workplace, as they are in every human endeavor. So in short, our feelings matter, and they're not good and they're not bad. And I don't know about you, but I'm in my early 50s, and I was sort of raised in this, like good emotions, bad emotions sort of thing. But realistically, our emotions govern almost everything that we say and do. And I'm just noticing the title and the author of the book is Mark Brackett, and the book is Permission to Feel, and everything, all of the resources will be posted on the handout, so thank you. Anyway, our feelings matter. And they direct almost everything that we do. They direct where our attention goes. They change how we perceive the world. So depending upon how we feel, it will affect decision making. It affects how we approach others and how they can approach us. So it affects all of our social reactions. We talked a lot about health already, but emotions actually cause different physiological reactions in our body, so it can impact our health. and it can directly impact our performance, our creativity, and our effectiveness. So we need to be able to use our emotions as tools. So building on emotional intelligence, once again, Mark Brackett, who's the author of Permission to Feel, he outlines a 5-step process, which you can see on the screen here, to help us positively regulate emotions. And notice that I'm saying regulate and not suppress. So the first thing is with R, recognizing our own emotions and those of others at the physiological level. So notice that you are feeling something. Because once again, a good majority of our emotions actually have physiological underpinnings. You know, your palms start to sweat, your heart starts to race, or you're feeling, joy and happiness. All of those can start at a physiological level. The next step then is to understand our feelings and see if you can determine the source. What caused them and how might this influence our behaviors? The next step is to label them and to be specific. And we tend to only talk about like 3 or 4 or 5 different emotions. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, maybe I'm frustrated. But there's a whole host of other kind of emotions out there, and you can Google like emotion wheels and that kind of stuff where you can really get specific about what you are feeling, because the better able you are to label it, the better able you are to address the issue that caused it. Or if it is a good feeling, do more of that. Then E, in terms of expressing. E can get a little tricky. You want to express your feelings in accordance with cultural norms and social contexts, but in a way that tries to inform and invites empathy from the listener. So once again, we're not saying just stick to the status quo, and if being frustrated or even angry at work is not okay, or if you've been taught that anger is like a bad feeling, when you feel angry or frustrated, how can you let the other person know in a way that invites conversation, in a way that invites like discussion and that kind of stuff. So we're not looking at suppressing emotions, because that is not healthy, but we're not also saying go in and just yell at people at work if you're feeling unhappy. But really, civility needs to allow the expression of all emotions in a way that is safe, but helps move us forward. That's kind of the key, is you want to be able to move forward. So regulating emotions rather than letting them regulate us. So once again, we've talked about talking about it quite a bit, and the author lays out basically 3 steps when you're having a conversation with somebody where you think you need to explain maybe how you're feeling. You state, here is what I feel and why. Here is what I want to happen next. And here is what I need from you right now. And when I first read that, I was like, that sounds great, but it seems a little bit overly simplistic. So for instance, I feel unconnected and disengaged when I feel like I'm not being heard. This can actually make me feel incredibly anxious, and then I get frustrated and angry. I also can get frustrated when I'm trying to figure out hard stuff, and there's hard stuff at work, like all the time. But how are other people, like if I'm working with Jean Heilig, how is she supposed to know, am I not being heard and that's why I'm frustrated, or am I trying to figure something out? And I've actually started to notice a certain tone in my own voice that I have not been able to eliminate. So the tone is there and I can hear it, but when I recognize the tone, depending on the situation I'm in, I'm able to say something like, you know what, I can hear this tone at my voice. I want you to know it's not directed at you. I'm frustrated and I'm trying to figure out this situation. So once again, this is what I feel and why. Here is what I want to have happen next, and here is what I need from you right now. So it's opening a dialogue, because we need to be able to give and receive feedback to really communicate with one another. And civility is all about claiming and caring for one's identity, one's needs, and one's beliefs without degrading somebody else's in the process. So difficult conversations, which I still avoid like the plague, actually do and can provide an opportunity to increase morale and develop collaboration and foster a more positive workplace. And I don't know about you, but like I am one of those people where if I have a difficult conversation that's coming up, I will like obsess over it. It will keep me up at night. But 9 times out of 10, if I kind of carefully maybe even write out what it is I want to say, and I bring it up to the person in a respectful manner, most of the time it goes a little bit better than I thought. That's not a guarantee, obviously, but a lot of times it really kind of opens the door. So, and I see that Kathleen is a fellow obsessor. So the next thing that you can do also is to continue to build relationships. Um, I happen to be a big fan of Brene Brown. I know some people love her, some people not so much. I happen to like her. But basically, she says that if incivility is contagious, so is civility, and that people are hard to hate close up. And I think I have found that to be true. The Institute for Civility in Organizations notes the importance of being able to disagree without disrespect. And so when we're talking about setting norms, once again, it's not like here's the status quo of behavior, but having people come together to set those norms. Like, if we're going to talk about difficult things, we need to assume best intent. How can we disagree without disrespect? Seeking common ground as a starting point for dialogue. Being aware of one's own biases, because they can actually really get in the way. Like by the time, if I've obsessed about this overnight, by the time I get to work, I already have a story in place about how Jean is going to react when I talk to her about this hard, sticky thing. And that's not really giving her credit to show up as herself. And then asking for feedback and honing in on your own blind spots. So get to know one another. Show people in your organization that they belong and that they matter. A lot of people were talking earlier about kind of common courtesy, good morning, please, and thank you, and active listening. This does not mean that you have to be best friends with everybody at work. We're just talking about, being civil and being able to talk to one another. Christine Porath, we had a quote from her earlier, but she's an associate professor of management at Georgetown and the author of Mastering Civility, which is also in your list of resources. She talks about thinking about when you're at work, how can you share resources? How can you share recognition? How can you share gratitude? How can you share feedback? And how can you share purpose? Because when you're coming together around those things and you're kind of seen as somebody who is welcoming and bringing other people into the fold, it can really go a long way. And all of the work that we do every day actually takes place within relationships that are often forged in non-work moments. So Jean, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Christine. We've already touched on a lot of these things in the session so far about, what can you do yourself? And communication is such a huge tool that we have. First of all, listening, practicing your active listening skills. Letting the other person know that you're listening to what they have to say and what they have to say is important. And that can be as simple as just nodding your head and making verbal affirmations every once in a while, but just showing that you are engaged. And writing. How many times have something happened and you automatically find yourself just slamming out an email and you hit send and you think, oh my God, I shouldn't have done that. Because sometimes when we react at the height of our emotions, we say things, and especially over email, that have such the wrong intent. And a lot of times it's better to go ahead and write that email and then sit on it. If you can sit on it for 24 hours is the best. If it needs to be, much quicker than even for an hour, just sit on it before you hit that send and see how you feel. Verbal communication is also very important. And that ties in with body language because it's really not what we say to people, but it's how we look when we say it. And this is becoming even harder as, so many of us are working remotely and working with patrons remotely. It's so difficult to read their body language over technology. So, this is a whole different world out there that we're having, to learn to deal with. So I think that body language is going to become, it's even more important because of masks, how we're holding ourselves. Do we have a closed body language, or are we open? So, it's kind of really turning things upside down a little bit for us. And maybe because of the technology involved, our verbal skills are becoming even more important than they have been in the past. So the tides are kind of turning a little bit. Um, some other things that you can do as far as managing yourself is, we need to take responsibility for our actions and try to practice self-restraint and anger management skills. And when we respond to potential conflicts, such as those emails that are drafted at the last second, we want to model good behavior. And, that's not just for supervisors. If we can all walk the talk, think of how much better we would be. Also, follow up on promises, not just for supervisors, but for all of us. You want to understand what your triggers and hot buttons are. Knowing what makes you frustrated and angry, it really enables you to manage your reactions and respond in a more appropriate manner. Relying on facts rather than assumptions. If you gather relevant facts, especially before acting on an assumption, they can really damage a relationship. Um, Try to pick apart how you respond when you're under stress. Don't argue. Hold your emotions in check. You want to avoid making it personal and curb your inclination to respond in kind.
Okay, so I have a couple things that I want to address in chat really quickly. I was trying to chat too fast, and it's now my turn to talk. So somebody wanted me to repeat the three things that the author of Permission to Feel said, and I should have turned it into a slide, and I apologize. So when you're wanting to talk to somebody about a sticky issue or kind of a feeling that you're having, you want, here is what I feel and why. Here is what I want to have happen next. And here is what I need from you right now. And I can't swear that my typing is good. We also had a question about if we came across anything about repairing work relationships that may have already been damaged. And Jean, I took a quick look at our, just a very brief look at our resources, and I didn't see anything that specifically addressed it. So what I might do is do some looking after our session and see what I can find out. However, I can share just a quick story with you. I, in a different workplace, kind of had a colleague where, for whatever reason, I can't even tell you like why we kind of just started jamming each other up. Like, she said blue, I said green. It kind of got to that point where no matter what the other person was talking about, we didn't agree. And it was something that, nobody else in the workplace kind of addressed. And ultimately, I ended up asking I finally was just like, I don't dislike this person. Like, I don't know why we're here. And so I asked the person to go to lunch, and I'm sure she was stunned, but we went and it was fine. So I basically was just like, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know exactly how we got here. I respect you. And we were able to kind of open up this conversation. So if I happen to find any other resources specifically addressing that, I will post them to the CSL In Session website also. So we're getting a little bit kind of closer to the end of our time. And one of the things that we wanted to give you a few minutes to do, we may not have quite as much time as we had hoped, but this is something that you can continue to work on your own. Basically, according to Christine Porath, and once again, she wrote the Civility Manifesto, one of the best things that you can do as an organization is to create group norms, defining civility for your organization and starting the discussions. And once again, these are best defined by everybody at the organization, not necessarily top down, because, once again, what one person thinks is civil or uncivil, it can vary. And so what you're trying to do is come up with group norms. However, we have 94 people on today, and you guys come from all different kinds of organizations. So what I thought we would have you do is start thinking about and potentially start drafting your own individual civility code. So you can see hopefully on the screen here, and it is also in the workbook if you had an opportunity to download that from the handout area, will also be available on the CSL in Session website later. But we have Brian Cave's Code of Civility, and it is from the Brian Cave Law Firm. And why a law firm? We just happen to see it referenced actually in more than one article talking about civility. So here is their civility code, and it covers things from greeting one another, saying please and thank you, treating each other equally with respect, no matter the conditions, acknowledging the impact of our behavior on one another. So once again, we might not intend to hurt somebody's feelings, but if they come to us and say that that happened, it's more the impact than the intent that matters. Addressing incivility when you see it, respecting each other's time commitments. So basically, it's a list of 10 things that this particular law firm put together. And what we'd like to have you do is take a look at these statements, note any that resonate with you, and maybe think about how you can draft some for yourself. So in the chat area, you can do one of two things, or you can do both. Put in chat which one of these statements, and you can either say by number or you can type it out, kind of really resonates with you as an individual, seems to align with your values. And is there anything that is missing? Is there anything that you would add to the civility statement that you might then consider drafting for your own? And when you're drafting your own civility statement, you might want to keep in mind, once again, we talked at the very, very beginning of the session, is when you feel unheard and when you feel disrespected. We talked a little bit about organizational mission and value statements, or your own values. So kind of keep those in mind. And as you start drafting, either in your workbook or on a piece of paper, start with I will and include action words. I will do this thing. I will acknowledge when I've hurt somebody's feelings. I will address incivility, these kinds of things. So I'm seeing people talking about what resonates with them. Having people acknowledge your work, that can be very important for some people, and letting people know that that's important to you can help. Saying please and thank you. 7, be direct, sensitive, and honest. Greeting and acknowledging please and thank you seem to be very popular. Is there anything missing from this list that you would add? Stephanie suggests that we all go watch Daniel Tiger, because that is where a toddler learns how to be a better person. Or, Mr. Rogers. I kind of regret that when I was a kid, I didn't realize the brilliance of Mr. Rogers until, I only did as an adult, like looking for the helpers and being a helper. Heather added, provide positive feedback where warranted. And I know I'm missing a bunch. Saying please and thank you seems to be super popular. And things like that can be very simple to ask people to do. I worked retail when I was in college, and it wasn't a horrible job. It wasn't a great job either. But I remember, like, you would get like awarded, like if you sold so much stuff, like you could get awards and stuff. And I wasn't great. I'm kind of a shyer person. I wasn't great at selling, and people were like, my boss one day asked me, like, how can you be happier at work? And basically that was my thing, is just like acknowledge that what I do matters, even if I'm not like bringing in all the dollars. So is there anything else that you guys might add for your own civility statement, or any ideas that you think that you would like to bring back to your place of work surrounding this? One and two, let's see. Yeah, and Colleen's making a point that when you're talking about being direct and sensitive and honest, you can be honest, but sometimes can still come across mean and uncivil. That is true. I assist when I can. Yeah, that's a great one, especially when we're talking about working in a support organization and kind of everybody needing, there are days that we need support just being at work, and how can we help each other out? And I think that goes back to what Christine Parath was talking about when, sharing resources and sharing feedback and all of that stuff. Provide positive feedback where warranted. And I think even Heather, it doesn't always have to be positive, but feedback can always be given in a positive way. Constructive feedback. If I'm messing up, I want somebody to let me know, but I would prefer that they don't let me know in public, and I prefer that they don't just tell me in a horrible way. Excellent. These are all great. So we only have a few minutes left. Continue adding that stuff in the chat. Um, so here are the two books that we talked about quite a bit: Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett and Mastering Civility. Once again, they're also listed in the resources, and everything will be posted on the CSL in Session website later. Um, Including the workbook and all of the session slides will be posted at the CSL in Session website probably within about a half an hour. So just very quickly, one last activity for you guys. Before we close, what is one thing that you gained from this session that you would like to take back to your organization? It could be a concept, it could be a resource, it could be one of the civility codes. But what is one thing that you would like to take back and share? And I like what Kim is saying about respecting people's time. People are liking the civility code. Impact versus intent. Yeah, that one I come back to quite a bit. The rule process, so kind of like thinking about how you deal with your emotions. Heather likes the idea of a civility code, even if it's only one in your mind. Yeah, because you know, we may not be in a great place at work, but we also bring our own stuff. And so if we can continue kind of to be the best that we do, and once again, that doesn't mean just letting people walk all over you, but if you are constantly kind of trying to step up to your own civility code, it can kind of go a long way. Patricia, it's difficult to receive backhanded comments that come across as somewhat insulting, which I call passive aggressive. Going forward, addressing those. Like, once again, if somebody says something and it just rubs you the wrong way, how can you, once again, in a nice way, provide some feedback to them that let them know? Because sometimes maybe they meant it and sometimes maybe they didn't. Yeah, these are all great. Yeah, ruler, Colleen, ruler is my friend. Using emotions as tools to help. Yeah, and I should have posted an emotion wheel, Stacy, on one of the slides, but you can literally Google it because there's a lot of them out there. So, well, thank you guys so much. We are coming to the end of today's session, and fabulous. At one point in time, we had like 93 people on, and everybody's chat was great. I will try to take some time to go through the chat and pull out some of the ideas and concepts that you guys shared, kind of stripping out people's names so that we kind of have another list of great ideas that you all shared, in addition to the resources. We do very quickly have a survey that we would love to have you fill out. You can click right on the slide, or I'm also pasting it in chat, because we'd like to know what you thought about today's session, what worked, what didn't, how can we make this session better. Also, if you do need a certificate for attending today, in just a second, I'm going to type my email in the chat so that you can email me directly. That way I have your email address, and I can send you a certificate. So I'll do that now. Okay, I just put my email in the chat, so you should be able to click right on that. And then our next CSL in session is scheduled for Tuesday, October 27th, and we're going to have staff from the Denver Public Library who is going to discuss their beginning reader evaluation product. And the link that is on the screen is to our CSL in session website, where hopefully in about a half an hour I will have all of the resources as well as the archive of today's session posted. And we only have a minute left, and since I've been talking like a ton here at the end of the session, I think I will give Jean Heilig a chance to say thank you as well. And I want to tell Jean thank you for.
Thank you for participating. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was wonderful. Like I said, like Christine said, we had a great group, and I tell you, you guys are so fast on the chat that it's hard for me to keep up. But that's why we have Christine, because she's so good at it. But thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. And I will work on getting the archive and the resources up. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks all.